On this edition of the Correspondents, the U.S. military fires a barrage of missiles into Syria in retaliation for a chemical weapons attack on civilians blamed on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Meantime, world reaction has been swift. Russia's president calls the U.S. move an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. And President Trump and China's Xi Jinping have their first face-to-face meeting in Florida in a high-stakes encounter on trade and North Korea. Hello, I'm Millar Sega, and this is the Correspondents on Voice of America. The U.S. military fired a barrage of missiles into Syria early Friday, the apparent retaliation for the gruesome chemical weapons attack Tuesday by President Bashar al-Assad's forces, an attack that killed about 100 civilians. It was the first direct U.S. assault on Syrian government forces. Here's VOA's Isabella Ciuccioli with more.
Dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from U.S. Navy destroyers in the Mediterranean in retaliation for the chemical weapons attack American officials believe Syrian government aircraft launched on a rebel-held town with a nerve gas, possibly sarin. After the strike, President Donald Trump spoke to reporters at his retreat in southern Florida.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
Trump called the chemical weapons attack this week very barbaric, saying Assad had choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children.
And for the latest now on this swift retaliatory attack against Syria's government, we are joined by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, who's standing by for us at the Pentagon. Thanks for joining us, Carla. And joining us in Washington, VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Selden. Again, I thank you both for joining us on such short notice. Carla, I'm going to start with you first. Now, this, as you know, would have been a busy news day by any measure. We had a visiting state leader, release of some important economic indicators. But I want you to bring us up to date. So how many Tomahawk missiles? What was their target? And did the Pentagon achieve its objectives?
The Pentagon is saying that yes, it did. We're still waiting for that damage assessment, but this was a very planned and prepared and properly executed site of launch that officials are telling me here. There were about 59 Tomahawk missiles that they used coming off of the USS Porter and the USS Ross. They were striking that base in Syria, which they think was where the launch from the chemical weapons attack earlier this week came from. They actually gave us reporters, they declassified what looked to be radar, where you could see the aircraft taking off from that Syrian base the day of the attack and going in during the attack. So they feel very justified in doing these strikes. They have told me, I've heard several officials say that these were proportionate to the chemical weapons attack.
Jeff, let me get your opinion on this. Was this a proportional response? After all, there are something like another 25 more airstrips there that Bashar al-Assad could use. Was this the correct response?
Well, it depends on what happens next, of course. This is, if you take a step back, this is quite remarkable because it was just last week we were hearing from administration officials a quite different tone on Syria. And then you have the chemical attack, and then you have President Trump coming out, other top officials saying this is something the U.S. had to do because it was in the interest of the U.S., national security interests of the U.S., and citing threats to regional stability, which is not the type of talk we've heard until now from this administration. But when you look at what the attack achieved, this was an attack designed to send a message. The Russians, who have personnel at that base where the Syrians launched the chemical attack from, they were warned ahead of time so they could get their people out. So this was definitely about sending a message. But the key thing that's going to happen is, how does the world react? Already we've heard Russia say that they're thinking about not enforcing the memorandum of understanding they have with the U.S. about deconflicting for the flights that both countries are running right now over Syria. The U.S. to strike against Islamic State, Russia, for what it says, are strikes against terrorist groups, including Islamic State. If you don't have that deconfliction, what happens? How does Bashar al-Assad react? This is a man who is supported by Russia. Russia is the only reason, according to intelligence officials, that he's been able to hold on to power as long as he has. Yet he's been willing to thumb his nose at Russia on occasion, where Russia has symbolically removed troops and removed support. What does he do next? And then once these countries make their moves, what's the second act for the Trump administration?
Right.
How do they follow it up? And there's been some concern by former officials who are already talking about a comment that came out of the Pentagon that this might have been a one-off strike. What type of message does that send if it's just a one-time deal?
I want to talk to you about the possible response afterwards, but I want to get Carla into this. Carla, what happens next here? What is the likelihood now of future strikes? Could we see a second act here?
Well, I think that this is going to depend on what the Syrians and what the Russians do next. As Jeff was mentioning, we did let the Russians know there were Russians on that base that was targeted. And we did let them know through our deconfliction channel what we were going to do. The strikes were conducted at the time that they were conducted. It was a little after 4:30 in the morning, local Syrian time, Friday today. And this was done so they could avoid as many casualties as possible. They didn't want people out there when they were targeting the aircraft that they targeted, the ammunition shelters that they targeted, et cetera, et cetera. So it was to send a message: don't use chemical weapons against your people. That's wrong. The U.S. is saying that they are going with the law of armed conflict here, that they are in the moral authority, the moral right. But as you see things unfold, Russia today is already saying that it wants to cut, and it has cut the communication line between the U.S. and Russia. That was a critical line that keeps deconfliction in the air, that prevents accidents in the air, that could escalate things between Russia and the United States. So everybody's treading carefully here, and we will just have to wait and see what happens next.
I guess, Jeff, crucial here is what the next party decides to do based on this attack. How does this change the situation on the ground, and what's going to be the likely response from Syria's Bashar al-Assad?
It's going to be interesting to see what happens on the ground, because there are a lot of players. And one U.S. official I was talking to said that the situation in general in Syria is like triage in an emergency room at a hospital. It's anything you do, you're making a choice. If you act in one area, there may be consequences in another area that perhaps spin out of control. There's a lot of concern. There are a lot of variables. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. How do groups like Islamic State try to use this to their advantage? How does a group like al-Qaeda, which has increasingly been gaining in strength in Syria, try to use this to its advantage?
I imagine this is going to help the rebels quite a bit.
It may help the rebels, but it may not, especially how much can they depend now on the U.S. again to ground the Syrian Air Force? If this is just sending a message and the U.S. isn't planning additional strikes or doesn't come through with additional strikes when Syria moves, how much of an advantage do the rebels gain? And at this point, given the years that Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, have had to degrade the rebels and kind of push them into very relatively small pockets, how much how much momentum are they going to be able to gain, even if they do get some help? How much potency? They'll be able to stick around, according to most people I talk to, but will they be able to push Assad back on his heels? And the other question is, to what extent is the U.S. looking to enforce regime change? When he was asked about that, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said a process is underway to remove Assad, but he also said first priority is destroying Islamic State. So
many questions, so little time. Carla, in the 10 seconds that I have, what do you expect to find out today?
Well, we're trying to find out how where the United States troops on the ground are. Are they protected? Because this does open up that can of worms. There was this unofficial agreement between Syria and the United States that they weren't striking at each other. Now the United States has struck the Syrians, and there are American troops in Syria. So that is the top priority for the Pentagon, keeping those men and women safe.
Keep us posted. Thank you so much, Carla and Jeff. We are far from done talking about this issue. Coming up next, world reaction to the U.S. response and what we might be able to expect next. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better. How do children learn to talk as they grow? That's what South Australian educators want to discover, so they installed listening devices in hundreds of homes, like the Dorian family home in Adelaide. Tina Dorian says the monitoring has helped her learn about her son Isaac's speech progression.
Isaac was quite slow to start using words, but we found that it was because of Lachlan talking for him.
The listening devices filter out background noise, highlighting conversations between parents and children, says researcher Katerina Ilutharu.
It's not who parents are, it's what they do with their children. So it could be simple activities like reading to their children, singing to their children, walking around the home.
When the children in this study start school, the researchers may learn more about the long-term educational impact of early language habits. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Now, international reaction to the U.S. missile strike on a Syrian air base as the world ponders the impact of the U.S. retaliation to the gruesome chemical weapons attack on civilians in Syria. Now, a Syrian watchdog says the air base attack killed at least 4 Syrian soldiers, while Syrian officials say 6 people were killed and several were wounded. Now, the Kremlin says the U.S. action inflicted considerable damage to already, quote, lamentable U.S.-Russian ties. Russia continues to insist that Syria has no chemical weapons. The Russian Foreign Ministry says it is now calling for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council and says the Syrian air safety agreement that has been in place with the U.S. has now been officially suspended. And for more now on the U.S. retaliation against Syria and the global reaction to that, I'm joined here in Washington by VOA White House correspondent Pete Heinlein. Thank you for joining us, Pete.
You're welcome.
And from our New York studio by VOA's United Nations correspondent Margaret Bashir. Thank you both for the quick turnaround on this developing story. It's going to be a busy day for both of you, but Margaret, I'm going to start with you. What can you tell us about Russia's request for an emergency meeting? What do they want to find out?
Well, actually, Mill, it's the Bolivians, who are friends of Russia, on the council, who requested the meeting last night once the missiles started flying. They were the first to put in a request for an emergency meeting. The council will meet here at about 11:30 in about 1 hour. We're going to hear a briefing from the UN political chief, Jeffrey Feltman. I think council members want to hear answers. They want to know whether this is a new U.S. policy on Syria or whether this is a one-off. We had some positive words. The British Defense Ministry called this a limited and appropriate reaction. The French and the Germans issued a joint statement. They said that Assad's crimes cannot go unpunished. So we've had some positive reaction. The Canadians also very positive, saying they fully support a limited strike. But then you have the Russians, who are furious. The Kremlin has said that our relations already are in a poor state and this will only hurt them further. Last night, there were meetings here late into the evening, and the Russian deputy ambassador told us that if there was to be unilateral military action by the Americans, there would be negative consequences, and that those consequences would fall firmly on the shoulders of those who initiated the military action.
Margaret,
so the Russians very concerned about this.
Margaret, I'm curious, was the UN Security Council warned ahead of time about the U.S. action, or did it come as a surprise?
Well, I can't say for sure. I know that some members of the council, some of our allies, did say that they received warning. I believe the Germans said that the Germans and the French, I believe, said in their statement they knew about it. I would assume the British knew about it as well. Okay. But I, don't know in terms of China and Russia. Right. I think there have been some mixed reports on whether the Russians knew.
Thanks,
Certainly,
Margaret.
I don't think they told the Chinese. They're not there. They don't need to.
Right. So, Pete, let me get you into this conversation. This missile strike obviously represents a big change of heart for the Trump administration, which, as early as last week, was saying Syria or Bashar al-Assad is not a very high priority for us. What changed?
Well, I think that it's an evolution. The Trump administration foreign policy is just coming into focus. On the other hand, I think there is a certain logic to what they're saying. You can see that a week ago, what they were saying is, we're not interested in overthrowing Assad. That doesn't mean that they accept him the legitimate leader of Syria. But then, when this happens, it changes the calculation completely.
It changes everything completely.
It turns him into a real pariah in the neighborhood, and it gives President Trump the opportunity he probably needed to show that he's not the same as his predecessor.
Yeah, it's obviously a big contrast, his reaction, the swift reaction to this, versus the previous administration, which sort of hemmed and hawed after pointing out that this is a red line that you don't cross.
He wants to send a signal, and he's been looking for a way to send a signal. And if this hadn't happened, something else would come along that gives him the opportunity to show that the United States policy toward this type of activity, wherever it occurs, is going to be a lot different. And he's going to be much more aggressive.
Margaret, getting back to you, we know Saudi Arabia, we know Turkey and Israel have been have welcomed this action. What does Iran have to say about this?
Well, the Iranian foreign minister was on Twitter a couple hours ago saying that, strongly condemning the chemical weapons, condemning the strike and saying that Iran has been a victim of chemical weapons in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein used them on Iran. And so he was strongly condemning the United States, though, for its strike. They're seeing it as aggression. And, look, Iran is Assad's biggest ally in the region. It's not good for them if he's weakened. They need him there. So, of course, they're not going to be comfortable with this. And, of course, there's an implicit message to Iran and to North Korea and to other, rogue countries that don't do this, or you could be next.
Pete, in an interesting political twist, the Trump administration, which has been badgered since January 20th with allegations of Russian collusion, does this put that whole issue to rest? What do you anticipate will happen? Is this going to give Trump cover to say that, see, I'm not working with the Russians?
I think this, again, plays right into Mr. Trump's hands. He has been denying this and at the same time has appeared to be moving closer to President Putin and the Russians. These collusion charges were a real irritant, and suddenly they're a sideshow. They're gone because now he's showing that has a new, tougher attitude toward Russia, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of that.
The image that is so far we've heard from the media regarding this president who's not been able to accomplish much outside of executive orders since January 20th.
That's right. And one can question whether those charges had any validity at all. But now he has a chance to show once and for all that he is going to be a tough guy.
Margaret, what actions, if any, can we expect from the UN Security Council in the coming days? Do you anticipate things will ratchet up where you are in New York?
Well, look, there were really contentious negotiations yesterday over three different variations on the same theme of a draft resolution condemning the gas attack on Tuesday in Syria. That's all sort of in limbo right now. Who knows if there'll be a resolution after this unilateral action. I think council members really just want to know what the United States' position is now. They hope to hear from Nikki Haley, I'm assuming, this morning. They want to get some reassurance about where this is all going. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what we're looking for in New York today.
Yeah, Nikki Haley, sort of U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley actually foreshadowed this, didn't she, when she spoke to the UN Security Council, didn't she?
Yeah, she said this week that if the collective, UN doesn't do anything about Syria, some countries may have to think about going it alone.
And
she did
exactly
sort of give
a
little warning.
Right, and that's exactly what they did on Thursday. Keep us posted.
And people were very nervous here last night.
Yeah, I can imagine. They
were, council members were nervous. They were worried something was going to happen.
As were a lot of people around the world. Margaret Bashir, thank you for keeping us posted. Pete Heinlein, thank you, but stick around. We're going to need you. Time now for another quick break. But when we come back, all of this news from Syria definitely has overshadowed a significant meeting that's happening in Florida right now between Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. We'll talk about that next. But first, a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
For science and technology, here's what's new.
Have a seat, grab a book, and breathe pollution-free air while you relax from a filter system that could be fitted to benches, bus stops, even city walls. Dirty air goes in the back, clean air comes out around the user. The system is made by Air Labs, whose CEO is Sophie Power.
So we clean nitrogen dioxide, which is, as you know, one of the biggest problems in European cities, especially where we have many, many diesel vehicles.
Independent testing shows the Air Labs filter removes about 90% of city air pollutants, according to Air Labs co-founder Matthew Johnson.
The air pollution over a city like London could be kilometers thick. You can't clean all of that air, but if you focus on the places where people are, it's a much smaller volume of treated air that you need.
Over 12 million people died in 2012 as a result of an unhealthy environment, according to the World Health Organization. For VOA's What's New, I'm Martin Seacrest.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, it's been a busy day. U.S. President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping meeting face-to-face for the first time at Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. The president himself tweeting last week that the high-stakes meeting was likely going to be a difficult one, given America's massive trade deficit with China, as well as North Korea's continuing nuclear provocations. VOA's Bill Ide has more from Beijing.
Just days before their meeting, President Trump issued 2 executive orders calling for a review of trade deficits and pledging severe consequences for those who cheat on trade. He did not mention China specifically, but did tweet about Chinese trade practices before signing the orders. Xi's 2-day visit to Florida is unlikely to resolve such complex issues, analysts say, but it could help set relations on a better path.
So clearly, President Xi Jinping is looking to establish a working relationship with President Trump so that the two sides can go through the many issues that are on the bilateral agenda. A strong personal relationship, working relationship, is crucial to achieving the bilateral goals from both sides.
Clearly, China is listening, and Beijing is trying to play up how it can help make America great again and address imbalances. Beijing denies it is deliberately seeking a trade surplus.
China will further increase domestic demand and will also raise demand for foreign goods and services, including those from the United States. Chinese investment in the U.S. has been rising rapidly in recent years.
And joining us now to discuss what might otherwise have been one of our top stories, we welcome back White House correspondent Pete Heinlein, and we say hello to our very own Steve Miller, host of VOA's Asia in a Minute. Thank you both for being here. Pete, this has been a busy week for anyone covering the White House, especially given all the meetings that are taking place right now. How is the meeting between these two leaders going so far?
Well, on the surface, it looks pretty good.
Yeah, they had dinner last night, right?
That's right, and you have to say, President Trump is a good host. He has a beautiful place there. He puts on a big spread, although I saw the bottles of wine were, I think, $11 each, but that's neither here nor there.
Are you accusing the president of being cheap?
It was very inexpensive wine that you can buy at the grocery store.
Let's watch where you end up sitting on the press row next time.
That's right. On the other hand, he did make a comment off the cuff saying, haven't gotten anything yet in his negotiations, and I think that's where we are right now.
Trying to inject a little bit of humor in there, but there's some weighty issues to discuss here, Steve Miller, everything from trade to North Korea, but all of a sudden, Syria has to be up there as well as one of the talking points. I'm sure China might have something to say about this.
Well, I think there was a lot of eyes on this meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. The expectations, as we heard in Bill Ide's piece, that this would set forward the avenue for good communications between the two countries, but the overall expectations that some kind of deal would be achieved wouldn't necessarily come through to fruition. So now that we have the Syria attack and the strike against the airstrip that launch those chemical weapons attacks, it does set the tone for what the United States may be willing to do moving forward in terms of North Korean policy, which is one of the top agenda items.
Pete, in a best case scenario, what would the United States like to achieve?
Well, I think the United States does have short-term goals. They'd like to hear something that the trade deficit is going to be, the Chinese are going to do something on trade deficit.
Are they likely to do something on the trade deficit? Can they do anything?
The Chinese are not really interested in that. The Chinese look at this in atmospheric terms. They want a statement to come out of this about win-win cooperation, about mutual respect. And so I think there's a difference of goals here, right, and the Chinese will probably prevail.
But Steve, I imagine the Syrian attack is likely to send a strong message to China regarding North Korea as well, right?
Yeah, you have to keep in mind that next week is the 105th anniversary of North Korean founder Kim Il-sung. It's widely regarded as one of the most important holidays in North Korea, the Day of the Sun. And typically North Korea either launches a series of ballistic missiles or carries out a massive medium or long-range missile.
We can expect big parades, basically.
You can expect a big parade. You can probably expect either a long-range missile. Last year, they launched a satellite into orbit. There's a lot of activity near the Punggye-ri nuclear test site, so there could be a nuclear test next week. So there's a lot of speculation of how the Syria attack could play into how the United States would respond, because we've heard statements over the last month or so that all options are on the table.
Pete, is North Korea likely watching a situation right now that's developing out there?
North Korea is watching intently, one can be absolutely sure. And if nothing else, the foreign policy, the first foreign policy thing that people are talking about today is the triangulation. Who's watching? Yes, Syria is watching, and the Russians are watching, but the Chinese are watching, and the North Koreans.
What's China able to do, though, in that situation? They have been North Korea's longtime ally, but they've not been really able to do much to control their little brother so far.
When you speak to analysts about North Korea and the Chinese influence, they've said that over time, especially in the last few years as Kim Jong-un has asserted his control in Pyongyang, is that the influence of China, of Beijing, has steered more towards the economic swing of things rather than political influence. And other analysts I've spoken to have said that as long as North Korea doesn't really affect Chinese interests, then Pyongyang will be allowed to continue its activities as long as it doesn't skew too far out of the norm.
Pete, I know yesterday was a dinner meeting with the first ladies of both countries, and they seem to be very congenial to each other. But today is when the brass tacks come out. This is when they start talking issues.
Well, this is the moment. Yes, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. At this moment, we really don't know what's going to be the outcome. But we do know that Xi Jinping is a veteran at this type of thing. Mr. Trump is a novice.
And we're going to be counting on you, Pete, and you, Steve, to keep us posted on all the developments. I thank you, Pete Heinlein and Steve Miller, but that is all the time we have. We hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. In the meantime, stay up to date with the latest world news at voanews.com. Do check out all of our shows there. All you got to do, click on the Watch tab on the upper right and pick your program. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. I'm Bill Arcega. Thank you for watching. For now, so long from Washington.